Welcome to History Respawned. I'm your host, Bob Whitaker. Today's episode considers Fallout 4, a game set in a post-apocalyptic future heavily influenced by a hyper-stylized version of 1950s America. With me to discuss this game is Dr. Jonathan Hunt, an incoming lecturer in modern global history at the University of Southampton. Dr. Hunt specializes in the international history of nuclear diplomacy. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Bob.
So, John, this game begins with a nuclear war between the United States and China, and this war creates the post-apocalypse that's seen throughout the Fallout series. This version of the post-apocalypse includes a brown and dusty, semi-arid wasteland filled with irradiated humans called ghouls, as well as a whole host of mutated plants and animals. What are the implications of nuclear war for humanity and the environment? And would nuclear war create the kind of brown and dusty wasteland that we see in the Fallout series?
What's fascinating about this question and why I think the creators of Fallout have had so much latitude in imagining the future as they see it in ways that do evoke the nuclear culture of the 1950s is that at the end of the day, no one truly knows what the world would look like after a major nuclear war. There were many studies beginning almost in the immediate aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that continued through the 1940s, the 1950s, 1960s, then resumed with a great deal of public interest and scrutiny in the 1980s about what would be left behind following a major all-out thermonuclear war. So there's sort of two ways in which the post-apocalyptic world was studied and envisaged by people in the 1950s. The first was through cultural representations. And the ones that come immediately to mind would be famous monster movies such as Them, which features sort of a attack of a colony of giant-sized radioactive ants. Godzilla, perhaps the most famous monster movie of them all, but also the movie On the Beach, which was based on a popular novel by the Australian novelist Neville Shute. The second way to look at it is the United States government and the U.S. military in particular were quite interested in what the aftermath of a thermonuclear war would look like. The U.S. military, the Defense Department, in league with the Atomic Energy Commission, undertook numerous studies in the 1950s and 1960s about the aftermath of a major nuclear war. The first studies looked primarily at casualty numbers, the impact on the economy, but as it became increasingly apparent toward the latter half of the 1950s that the residual fallout from a nuclear war would also be a major challenge for the recovery of the nation after the conflict. And what was concerning to scientists as well as to the military were discoveries that plant and animal life have different resistances to radioactivity. Human beings are, in fact, neither the least nor the most susceptible to ionizing radiation. There would be many, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of casualties from the fallout after a nuclear war, a major nuclear conflict. But you also had to take into account that livestock would be affected severely. Not only livestock, but trees as well. One of the interesting discoveries, I think around 1960s, was in Tennessee. They had built an experimental reactor, a small nuclear reactor that they used really for research and development purposes. And during the construction, they failed to shield the fissile material properly. And so one side of the reactor was essentially emitting ionizing radiation. And what they discovered were the pine trees that surrounded this experimental reactor were dying off, and they were dying off incredibly quickly. What they found as they started doing studies, biologists, but also some of the early ecologists, was that softwood trees are more susceptible to ionizing radiation than hardwood trees. And keep in mind that softwood trees, or coniferous trees, make up 80% of the timber that's used for any economic activity, for building houses, for building roads, playgrounds. More or less, 4/5 of all timber comes from trees that would be incredibly vulnerable in the aftermath of a nuclear war. So if you extrapolate from the most likely targets in a major nuclear conflict during the Cold War, which were cities where a number of industries, especially industrial plants, tended to congregate, where the political nerve centers resided. And then you added to that the fact that these clouds of radiation that could also often themselves be the size of a state would wipe out large percentages of timber resources in the United States. Political and military elites started asking themselves, exactly what were you going to rebuild with? You no longer had concrete being produced by factories, most of which would have been destroyed. You also had to question whether you could build, say, a post-apocalyptic school with wood, because the wood resources just simply wouldn't be there in the abundance that Americans were used to.
So it seems like in their original estimates, we would literally be sent back to the Stone Age because we wouldn't have building materials.
Yeah, and that was the popular expression. I think it was first coined by the Secretary of the Air Force, Curtis LeMay, who was also the one who authorized, the military official who authorized the strike on Hiroshima. And while it does play into some of the civilizational discourse of the 1950s, there's this idea that is still, rather prevalent today, that there are certain ages of civilization, that you go from the stone to the bronze to the iron, and eventually to the steam and industrial era, culminating in the nuclear age. There was a germ of truth to it, which was nuclear war in many ways. And the aftermath of nuclear war was simply the development of our advanced industrial societies in reverse at a much faster clip.
So like I said, the game, as you're walking around, you see what amounts to a brown and dusty wasteland. I mean, were there any estimates done by the government to kind of guess as to what the Earth would look like in the post-apocalypse?
There's two ways to look at it. Is it accurate in terms of what people in the 1950s, scientists, policymakers thought? I would say yes. There was one biologist whose name escapes me for the moment, but what he essentially said was, if you look at sort of variation in susceptibility to radiation, the life forms that were most likely to thrive after a nuclear war were insects, and in particular cockroaches. And so when you see the rad roaches, the rad scorpions, this was something that sort of percolated through popular culture, but it did have a firm basis in scientific study. As for the sort of desiccated brown landscape, the dying trees, I went back at the photograph that they took of the research reactor with the faulty shielding, and it looks almost exactly like Fallout 4, the area around Boston. And so I not only think that is accurate to what they believed in the 1950s, I also think it's accurate as to what would be the reality. But again, this is a question it's really hard to answer, because thankfully we've never had a nuclear war. And second of all, we don't know if that ecological reality would stay the same for a long period of time. From my understanding, the game takes place a number of decades, maybe even a century or more after a thermonuclear war.
About a century later.
Yeah, over a century later. I think, and again, I'm not an ecologist, I'm not a scientist, and so I can only speak from my sort of amateurish interest as a historian who is conversant about the state of the art in the 1950s. But the thing about ecosystems is that they tend to be incredibly resilient. And at the end of the day, those massive die-offs would also provide a basis for the next ecosystem to emerge. And that ecosystem might not resemble what Boston looked like before this hypothetical war, but it wouldn't necessarily look the way that it's depicted in the game, which strikes me as more accurate and sort of the years coming soon after a nuclear war, but a century, after a century, I really think you would see more recovery than is in the game.
Wow. Well, that's good news to me. I mean, nuclear war, not necessarily the end of everything. It's you're telling me there's a chance, right?
Well, I mean, if you look at Chernobyl, for instance, Chernobyl is the best. It's essentially our one case study of what a nuclear war would look like. And what's shocking is 25 years later, or more than 25, almost 30 years later, the area surrounding Chernobyl has essentially become a nature preserve. And so because most of the humans have left the area, this massive area in eastern Ukraine, it has permitted what was previously the natural state of affairs to return. I mean, it's still in ways subtle and big, different than what came before, but the absence of human beings in some ways is more beneficial, and beneficial might be the wrong word, but more significant for how an ecosystem changes over time than the war itself, at least as you get further and further from, time zero.
Well, you heard it here first, folks. Man is worse than nukes.
Well, I mean, that's assuming that we didn't build the nukes ourselves. So.
Well, that's true. So we're doubly bad. Well, let's move on to the next question. So the Fallout series takes place in a world that is perpetually stuck in an alternative, warped version of the 1950s. What do you make of Fallout's version of 1950s culture, and does the 50s culture depicted in Fallout 4 bear any resemblance to the real America in the 1950s?
That's an interesting question, and honestly, my immediate response is that the 1950s have always been more about myth than reality for American culture and in American politics. If you look at the presidency of Ronald Reagan, for instance, 30 years after the 1950s, he would continually hearken back to this golden age of culture, of society, of politics, before everything got messy and divisive in the late 1960s and the 1970s. So where I think Fallout is it's interesting, I think it invokes in some ways our memories of the 1950s more than the 1950s itself. Right. And how I'd explain it is the 1950s were exceptional in a number of ways, mostly having to do with the American economy. The Second World War had the effect of devastating every other center of industrial production on the planet. And so the United States, as of 1945, possessed over 1/2 of all industrial production in the world. So the United States in 1945, but especially in 1950, once it itself had truly fully recovered from the war, was at a unique place in both its history and in global history. And so the 1950s, the sort of cult of prosperity, of affluence, of abundance, was in full sail. Now, this is not to say that American society was all Leave It to Beaver and Morning in America. There were, of course, incredible social, political, racial, ideological divisions in the country that when people talk about the 1950s, they often like to sort of sweep beneath the rug. So this is where Fallout, I think, plays into the stereotype of the 1950s that is regularly trotted out in order to talk about a time when everything was hunky-dory in the United States. And if only we could go back to the 1950s, we would live in a better society.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that stands out about the Fallout series and their treatment of the 1950s is this depiction of rampant anti-communism. You see it throughout the game's use of advertising. There's all of these things about watching out for the Red Menace.
Right. The sort of loose lips, sink ships rhetoric.
And it's just amazing to me that, in the context of that game, that kind of rhetoric, the kind of McCarthyite rhetoric, goes on for over 100 years before there's a nuclear war. To think that you could live in a society in that kind of state of mind for over a century is pretty incredible. What do you think of that?
It's a fascinating counterfactual, because the 1950s were the apogee of anti-communism in the United States. As you correctly pointed out, McCarthy's crusade, and we don't have time to get into the character of McCarthy, who is himself fascinating, but the era of McCarthy, the era of, even before McCarthy, the purges of the State Department, tended, by the end of the 1950s, to be mitigated somewhat. You see less of it in the early 1960s, less of the responses, better dead than red, that we'd rather lose a nuclear war than to put ourselves at the mercy of our communist foes. That being said, this anti-communism reemerges with a vengeance in the 1980s, especially with the Committee on the Present Danger, the rise of the neoconservatives and the Republican Party. All of this is often kind of personified in the character of Ronald Reagan, who makes remarks in 1983 that communism would place itself on the ash heap of history, which was in fact a paraphrase of Lenin's own critique of capitalism. So it's not as if anti-communism did not have a prolonged life during the Cold War. Now, this didn't stop Reagan from negotiating and developing a rapport with Mikhail Gorbachev, but one wonders if Gorbachev had never entered the scene, and if relations between the United States and the Soviet Union had remained fraught as they were in the 1980s, which was in some ways as dangerous as the 1960s. In an alternate universe where Mikhail Gorbachev does not rise to become the General Secretary of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union manages to hold on a little longer, it's not implausible, it's not unreasonable to imagine a future where American politics is still defined by anti-communism.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's an interesting counterfactual to play around with. So the pre-war culture in the Fallout series places a great deal of stock in the ability and potential of nuclear power to solve problems. Was this type of optimism regarding nuclear power and technology common in the 1950s and the Cold War more generally?
Absolutely. Answer the first question in the 1950s with a resounding yes. Throughout the Cold War, there are some inflection points. Obviously, the 3 Mile disaster in 1979 and then Chernobyl in 1986. Both of those somewhat subverted the idea that nuclear power was the solution to all of mankind's energy problems. This was not the case in the 1950s. In the 1950s, for a number of reasons, nuclear energy emerged as something of a panacea, not only as a energy source of potential unlimited capacity and cheap cost, but also a way to cure cancer, to eradicate disease, and eventually to provide us with what was described as energy too cheap to meter. So nuclear power, the ability to produce electricity from either nuclear fission or from nuclear fusion, was really the centerpiece of atomic energy's claim to fame. Now, this was not simply a manifestation of the inherent promise of nuclear technology. Like many forms of technology, there tends to be an initial phase of boosterism and optimism that's eventually undercut by the fact that, the economic principle, there's no such thing as a free lunch. There's usually some kind of downside that you're going to have to deal with in order to make a technological regime work. In the case of nuclear power, that had to do with radioactivity and also the potential for meltdowns, both of which made it incredibly costly to build a nuclear power plant, but also incredibly costly to ensure a nuclear power plant, let alone to deal with the radioactive waste that was the necessary byproduct of the fuel cycle. So in the 1950s, I think some of it was the lure of something new. A second part of it was that the U.S. government, and to a certain extent, most other governments that started their own major civilian or military nuclear programs purposefully underscored the developmental, the economic promise of nuclear energy in order to call attention away from the fact that most of this money was being spent in order to build nuclear warheads and to fit them on to intercontinental ballistic missiles, various types of ballistic missiles in the 1950s and 1960s.
Right. Well, something that is really strange in the game is one of the weapons. It's called a Fat Man, which it allows you to catapult a small nuclear bomb at your enemies. But as we were talking before our recording, you had mentioned that this weapon actually has some basis in fact.
The U.S. military did indeed develop something that came very close to a shoulder-mounted nuclear weapon launcher. And it was called the Davy Crockett, which still stands as probably the most surreal delivery system ever developed for a nuclear weapon. Now, the Davy Crockett, it had a tripod, and so you wouldn't carry it. You would kind of set it down next to you, and then it would launch a rocket at an enemy formation. It would have been described as a tactical nuclear weapon, which was a nuclear weapon intended for use against military units, as opposed to strategic targets such as military bases or cities. And it existed. The Eisenhower administration, it was developed during the Eisenhower administration. To my knowledge, I'm not sure whether or not it was put into the field. I wouldn't be surprised if a few of the units were stationed with U.S. forces in Germany during the Cold War. But what was immediately obvious and is actually referenced in the video game is the person who uses the Davy Crockett was almost as vulnerable to the resulting nuclear explosion as the people whom it was targeted against. So it quickly kind of fell out of fashion or fell out of favor because not only were you going to have to deal with the resulting fallout, assuming that you were going to be outside the blast radius, but even if you were to use it on the battlefield, and this is a general weakness of tactical nuclear weapons that people often don't think about. Often people say, well, why wouldn't we just use nuclear weapons in a military engagement against a take formation? And the problem is, once you use the nuclear weapon, then you have to fight in a nuclear environment, which means that, you would want to be wearing something like the armor in Fallout that would be lead-lined, and also to have gas masks that could filter out radioactive radioisotopes. And that tends to be prohibitively difficult to do in a combat situation.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, that's really interesting. I'm not surprised that the U.S. government didn't want to invest in hazmat suits and power armor for all of their soldiers.
Yeah.
So it's not surprising.
The French went so far as to test small tactical nuclear weapons and then send military troops into the blast zone in order to simulate fighting conditions. So, in the 50s and 60s, something Fallout does get right is that the military and the political elites in nuclear weapon states in the United States, in France, I can only assume in the Soviet Union, really did plan to fight and win a nuclear war.
Crazy. Well, so as with past games in the series, the player character in Fallout 4 emerges from an underground vault. How common were Fallout shelters during the Cold War, and were there any plans for shelter development on the scale seen in the vault system for the Fallout series?
So the quick answer to that question would be not as common as you would think, and there were not plans for major civilian shelter deployment or construction. There were a number of Fallout shelters that were built in major metropolitan areas. These were often financed by the cities themselves. The federal government had a civil defense agency. There was a certain amount of money that was delegated to it, but it quickly became apparent, especially as the nuclear stockpiles on both sides of the Cold War accumulated, that to have a viable shelter program in which you could provide shelter to, let's just say, all the inhabitants of a city like New York was going to require huge investments. It would have cost a lot of money. And, frankly, from what I can tell, the U.S. military, or really the U.S. government, ended up deciding, U.S. Congress basically, that it would rather spend the money on nuclear weapons in order to deter the possibility of a nuclear war than to build fallout shelters. And this wasn't just a money-saving decision. They also made this decision because once you start planning to fight a major strategic level thermonuclear war, a nuclear war where you're lobbing missiles at Moscow and New York and Chicago and Vladivostok, things get out of hand really fast, and you just can't control the consequences. So there was a nuclear strategist, probably the most famous nuclear strategist, besides Thomas Schelling, Herman Kahn. And Herman Kahn wrote a tome, this 800-page book titled On Thermonuclear War, where he went through every permutation of nuclear war that he could think of and the strategies that you would develop in order to win those wars. And one of the variables he had to look at was the provision of shelters, because if you have more shelters, more of the citizenry will survive, and you'll be able to rebuild the American political and economic system more swiftly. The problem with this is, once you start building those shelters and once you predicate your nuclear strategy on fighting a nuclear war and winning a nuclear war, it signals to your adversary, it signals to the Soviet Union that you want to fight a nuclear war. And when push came to shove, and especially after the Berlin crisis of 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the American government, the Kennedy administration, basically decided, under no circumstances do we want to fight a nuclear war. It's not worth spending the money on fallout shelters because, as one individual put it, it would be better to be dead than to survive World War III. Precisely because you would emerge in what would be political chaos, environmental devastation, and complete economic breakdown that would make the Depression of the 1930s look like Christmas Day.
Yeah. All right, so one final question. One of the main factions that you encounter in Fallout 4 is a group called the Institutes. And this group is made to represent the remnants of a fictionalized version of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or better known as MIT. And much like its real-life counterpart, the Institute was heavily involved in military research before the nuclear war, and has, by the start of this game, continued that research to create new weapons, such as a whole new class of robots that resemble humans. While American military science has yet to produce anything resembling a synth, the game does accurately allude to the close relationship between the military and American universities during the Cold War. Could you tell us and our viewers a bit more about this history and this relationship?
Absolutely. That very much was a product of the Cold War, and something that a relationship that still continues, albeit in a somewhat lesser form today. So historians of science and technology like to talk about the origins of big science during the Cold War, but really the origin story is the Manhattan Project. The more famous story, of course, is the letter from Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard that eventually wended its way to FDR, who ultimately approved, who ultimately authorized the largest government-led science project in history. But people forget that the science advisor to the president, or it wasn't an official title at the time, but if it existed, he would have held it, was Arthur Compton, the president of Harvard. So much of the research and most of the scientists who ended up working on the Manhattan Project were major research institutions in the United States or came from U.S. research institutes. The Manhattan Project, the very first achievement for Manhattan was when the first nuclear reactor goes critical. And that happens at the University of Chicago in a large room underneath the football stadium. And it's designed by a cohort of scientists, but really the leader of that group was Enrico Fermi, who was an Italian scientist who had come to the United States because of his detestation of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. Very quickly, a number of other U.S. universities got in on the game. And again, I can't leave out the University of California, Berkeley, where you had the laboratories of Ernest Rutherford, who had been responsible for many of the early studies having to do with particle physics using what was called a cyclotron, which was sort of the CERN of its day. The Manhattan Project couldn't have gotten off the ground without the science, the basic science and the applied research that was being conducted at U.S. universities even before the Manhattan Project. And they're quickly drawn into this huge science project during the Second World War, which ultimately culminates in the Trinity test in Alamogordo, New Mexico, in July of 1945. That's really the beginning of a close partnership between the U.S. military, the U.S. government, what Dwight D. Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, and what the Arkansas Senator William Fulbright called the military-industrial academic complex. And the reason that Fulbright added academic was that the Pentagon, the National Science Foundation, eventually NASA, were all pouring huge amounts of grant money into laboratories at institutions like MIT. The biggest winners in this sort of government lotto were MIT, Stanford, Berkeley, Harvard to a lesser extent, and a number of state schools. Michigan, Berkeley is a state school too, but it was kind of one of the bell cows. Michigan, the University of Texas, Carnegie Mellon, a number of others. And so it somewhat paralleled, but also essentially financed the establishment of a number of new disciplines in the sciences, things such as aeronautics, of course, nuclear physics, material sciences, but also a lot of money for electrical and electronic engineering, and eventually early cybernetics and computers.
And we should also mention the money poured into the humanities during the Cold War. For instance, I think could be argued that area studies wouldn't exist without the Cold War.
Oh, absolutely. Area studies, which then took a huge hit after the end of the Cold War, to the great detriment of our intelligence agencies. If you talk to anybody in D.C. about their frustration about the disappearance of area studies, they talk about how much harder it is now to find experts on countries,
right.
Let alone regions. So the humanities, the social sciences, I mean, there's kind of an avalanche of money that gets thrown at the American university system during the Cold War. And it went back before Sputnik. Sputnik ratcheted it up because for the first time, the United States felt like it was behind the Soviet Union in advanced technology. But I mean, one of the clearest ways to illustrate this is NASA, is the space program, which famously or infamously, depending on your political point of view, was more or less a smokescreen for our missile program. A lot of the missile technology that was developed with this peaceful intent of exploring and potentially colonizing space was really fed back into the military in the design and the construction of hundreds of intercontinental ballistic missiles, which more or less do the same thing as a NASA rocket. They exit the atmosphere, they leave Earth's gravity more or less, they deploy a capsule. It's just that the capsule comes back to Earth much faster. Well, it doesn't slow down, it doesn't have parachutes. And instead of astronauts, it's carrying between 1 and 12 nuclear warheads.
So a fraught history, one that I think is pretty well depicted in this game, especially with the kind of the bent of the Institute and their mission, their belief that the world would be a better place if everything on the surface was wiped out and leaving them to do their research. Yeah,
I think what does tend to get left out, obviously the people working at institutions like MIT, the scientists who brought in this grant money, they were very savvy. These were savvy operators who knew who was buttering their bread. And so they would often go to the U.S. government with projects, with laboratories, with research programs that when they wrote them up in the proposal sounded very good for the bureaucrats back in Washington. But really, they just wanted to get the money. And then once they got the money, they more or less turned that funding to their own ends, which more often than not was basic research and really interesting applied science. Many people criticize, and I think there is grounds to criticize, that close relationship, that cozy relationship between academia and the military and the federal government. That being said, at the end of the day, money is money, and the science and the applied technology that it funded at places like Stanford and places like MIT are the reasons that we had the pharmaceutical revolution of the 1970s and 1980s, and that we had the computer revolution, the information age, comes out of Cold War defense spending. And if you go down to Silicon Valley, that's just built on the backbone of the military-industrial complex. So there were ways in which American science was compromised by that relationship. But that being said, we might not all be carrying smartphones in our pockets if not for that avalanche of money.
Well, on that note, I think that's going to do it for us today in History Respawn. Thanks again to my guest, Dr. Jonathan Hunt. Please tune in next month for another episode.